The echoes of cannon fire had barely faded, yet the world was poised on the precipice of an even greater catastrophe. Just 2 decades after the war to end all wars, humanity found itself hurtling towards another, more devastating conflict, World War II. Its scale was unprecedented, its brutality unimaginable, and its consequences shaped the modern world in ways we are still grappling with today. This is the story of how the world, still bleeding from its last wounds, failed to prevent the next, tracing the critical path from fragile peace to global war. World War I concluded with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, an attempt to forge a lasting peace that ultimately sowed the seeds of future conflict. Germany, defeated and humiliated, was subjected to harsh terms, territorial losses, demilitarization, and crippling reparations. The infamous war guilt clause placed sole responsibility for the war on Germany, fostering deep resentment among its populace and fueling a narrative of injustice. This punitive peace created fertile ground for extremist ideologies to take root, especially in the economically battered German nation. The fledgling Weimar Republic, Germany's democratic government established after the Kaiser's abdication, struggled under the weight of the Versailles Treaty. The nation experienced devastating hyperinflation in the early 1920s, rendering its currency worthless and wiping out savings. This economic chaos, coupled with political instability and a lingering sense of national humiliation, eroded public trust in democratic institutions. The middle class, once a stabilizing force, became increasingly desperate and susceptible to radical political promises, creating a volatile social landscape. Just as Germany began to stabilize, the Wall Street crash of 1929 triggered the Great Depression, an economic cataclysm that swept across the globe. International trade collapsed, unemployment soared, and poverty became rampant. The crisis hit Germany particularly hard, as its economy was heavily reliant on American loans. This global downturn further destabilized democracies, amplified social grievances, and pushed millions towards extremist solutions. It was a period of immense suffering, fueling resentment and a yearning for strong leadership that promised order and prosperity. Amidst the post-WWI disillusionment and economic instability, a new ideology emerged: fascism. In Italy, Benito Mussolini, a charismatic former socialist, capitalized on nationalistic fervor, social unrest, and fear of communism. He promised to restore Italy's glory and establish order, leading his blackshirts in a march on Rome in 1922. King Victor Emmanuel III appointed him prime minister, effectively ushering in the first totalitarian fascist state. Mussolini's regime emphasized national unity, militarism, and the absolute authority of the state, serving as a model for other aspiring dictators. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazis, exploited the same anxieties. Hitler, a failed artist and decorated World War I veteran, fused extreme nationalism, anti-Semitism, and anti-communism into a potent ideology. He blamed Jews, communists, and the November criminals, those who signed the armistice, for Germany's woes, promising to restore national pride and power. His captivating rhetoric, combined with the party's disciplined paramilitary SA, Sturmabteilung, gained increasing traction among a desperate populace looking for a scapegoat and a savior. After years of political maneuvering and rising electoral success, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany on January 30, 1933. This marked a turning point. Within months, he systematically dismantled democratic institutions. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 provided a pretext to suspend civil liberties, and the Enabling Act in March granted him dictatorial powers. Political opponents were arrested, concentration camps were established, and Germany rapidly transformed into a one-party totalitarian state. The Nazis' grip tightened, silencing dissent and consolidating absolute authority. At the core of Nazism lay a virulent ideology centered on racial purity, anti-Semitism, and the concept of a Lebensraum or living space. Hitler believed in the superiority of the Aryan race, specifically Germanic peoples, and sought to create a racially pure society. Jews were scapegoated as the primary enemy, blamed for all of Germany's problems. Lebensraum dictated that Germany needed to expand eastward into Slavic lands to provide resources and territory for its master race, setting the stage for aggressive territorial expansion and unprecedented brutality. Beyond Europe, another militaristic power was rising, Imperial Japan. Driven by a rapidly growing population, limited natural resources, and a fervent nationalist ideology, Japan sought to establish dominance in East Asia. Its military leaders believed that expansion was essential for Japan's economic survival and national destiny. Unlike European dictatorships, Japan retained its emperor as a divine figurehead, but real power increasingly lay with a militaristic faction that prioritized conquest and an erasure for Asian sphere of influence, free from Western interference. Japan's expansionist ambitions first manifested in 1931 with the invasion of Manchuria, a resource-rich region in northeastern China. Using a staged incident at Mukden as a pretext, the Japanese Kwantung Army swiftly occupied the territory, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo. This blatant act of aggression violated international law and the principles of the League of Nations. Despite China's appeals, the League proved ineffective, issuing only a mild condemnation and taking no concrete action. This failure emboldened aggressor nations and exposed the League's fundamental weakness. The invasion of Manchuria was just the beginning. Tensions escalated, leading to the full-scale Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. Following the Marco Polo Bridge incident, Japan launched a brutal invasion of mainland China, targeting major cities like Shanghai and the capital Nanjing. The conflict was marked by immense civilian casualties and atrocities, most notably the rape of Nanjing. This protracted and devastating war would tie up a significant portion of the Japanese military for years, but it also demonstrated Japan's ruthless determination to dominate Asia, ignoring international outcry. The League of Nations, founded after World War I to ensure collective security, proved tragically inadequate in confronting these acts of aggression. Its inability to enforce its resolutions, especially against powerful states, rendered it largely toothless. Member states, reeling from the Great Depression and reluctant to risk another costly war, often prioritized national interests over collective action. The League's failures in Manchuria, Ethiopia, and against German rearmament signaled to aggressor nations that international norms could be violated with impunity, effectively dismantling the post-WWI world order. Defying the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler initiated a covert rearmament program immediately upon taking power. By 1935, he openly repudiated the treaty's military clauses, announcing the reintroduction of conscription and a massive expansion of the German army, navy, and air force, Luftwaffe. Western powers, particularly Britain and France, reacted with protests but no decisive action. Their reluctance to confront Germany stemmed from a mix of economic hardship, a desire to avoid war, and a belief that a stronger Germany might serve as a bulwark against Soviet communism. In March 1936, Hitler took another audacious gamble. He ordered German troops to remilitarize the Rhineland, a region bordering France and Belgium that the Versailles Treaty had designated as a demilitarized zone. This was a direct provocation, and Hitler himself admitted that had France acted, German forces would have retreated. However, France, paralyzed by political division and fearing a repeat of World War I, did not respond militarily. Britain advised caution, and the League of Nations offered only condemnation. Hitler's gamble paid off, further enhancing his prestige and encouraging more aggressive actions. From 1936 to 1939, Spain plunged into a brutal civil war, becoming a dress rehearsal for the larger conflict to come. Nationalist forces, led by General Francisco Franco, rose against the democratically elected Republican government. Hitler and Mussolini provided crucial military support to Franco, deploying their air forces, Legion Condor, and ground troops. The Soviet Union, in turn, supported the Republicans. This conflict allowed Germany and Italy to test new weapons, tactics, and their burgeoning alliance, observing the devastating effectiveness of aerial bombing and mechanized warfare firsthand. The shared ideological grounds of fascism and Nazism, coupled with their intervention in Spain, brought Italy and Germany closer. In October 1936, a formal agreement was signed between the two powers, creating the Rome-Berlin Axis. This informal alliance solidified their cooperation and presented a united front of revisionist powers against the status quo. The Axis powers sought to overturn the Versailles Order and expand their influence, signaling a clear challenge to the democracies of Western Europe. Japan would later join this pact, forming the Tripartite Pact in 1940. Hitler's next target was Austria, his birthplace. Despite the Treaty of Versailles explicitly forbidding the union, or Anschluss, of Germany and Austria, Hitler orchestrated a campaign of political intimidation and internal subversion. In March 1938, German troops marched into Austria, meeting little resistance and, in many areas, widespread public support from Austrian Nazis. Western powers again issued condemnations but took no action. The Anschluss dramatically expanded Germany's territory and resources, reinforcing Hitler's belief that the international community lacked the will to stop him. Emboldened by his successes, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland region, home to a significant German-speaking population. He demanded its cession to Germany, claiming oppression of ethnic Germans. Czechoslovakia, with its strong defenses and alliances with France and the Soviet Union, was prepared to fight. However, Britain and France, desperate to avoid war, pursued a policy of appeasement. They believed that by satisfying Hitler's reasonable demands, peace could be preserved. The crisis culminated in the Munich Conference in September 1938, where leaders from Germany, Italy, Britain, and France met. Czechoslovak representatives were notably excluded. Under immense pressure, Britain's Neville Chamberlain and France's Edouard Daladier agreed to Hitler's demand, ceding the Sudetenland to Germany. Chamberlain returned to Britain declaring a peace for our time, believing he had averted war. While widely celebrated at the time, the Munich Agreement is now seen as the zenith of appeasement, sacrificing a sovereign nation for a false sense of security and demonstrating the futility of negotiating with an insatiable aggressor. The promise of peace for our time proved tragically short-lived. Barely 6 months after the Munich Agreement, Hitler brazenly violated his pledges. In March 1939, German troops invaded the remainder of Czechoslovakia, dissolving the country and establishing the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. This move, which involved no claim to self-determination for ethnic Germans, finally shattered the illusion for British and French leaders. It became clear that Hitler's ambitions extended far beyond revising the Treaty of Versailles or uniting German-speaking peoples. He sought outright conquest and domination. The invasion of Czechoslovakia marked a decisive shift in Anglo-French policy. Recognizing that appeasement had failed, Britain and France finally issued a guarantee of Poland's independence in March 1939. This commitment meant that if Germany attacked Poland, Britain and France would come to its aid. It was a clear warning to Hitler, signaling that further aggression would lead to war. However, it also put enormous pressure on Poland, making it Hitler's next inevitable target and setting the stage for the final countdown to global conflict. In a move that shocked the world, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, ideological archenemies, signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact on August 23, 1939. Publicly, it was a pledge of neutrality. Secretly, however, the pact included protocols dividing Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence, with Poland to be partitioned between them. This cynical agreement removed the threat of a two-front war for Germany, cleared the path for the invasion of Poland, and left Britain and France isolated in their commitment to Polish sovereignty. With the Soviet flank secured, Hitler launched his invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939. German forces unleashed a new form of warfare, the Blitzkrieg or Lightning War. This involved swift, coordinated attacks by tanks, panzers, motorized infantry, and overwhelming air support, Luftwaffe, designed to bypass static defenses and achieve rapid breakthroughs. Polish forces, despite fierce resistance, were quickly overwhelmed by the speed and power of the German assault. The invasion marked the true beginning of World War II, shattering any remaining hopes for peace. 2 days after the invasion of Poland, on September 3, 1939, Britain and France issued ultimatums to Germany demanding their withdrawal. With no response from Berlin, both nations declared war. The solemn declarations ended 2 decades of tenuous peace and signaled the start of the largest, most destructive conflict in human history. While the immediate trigger was Poland, the underlying causes lay in the unresolved grievances of World War I, the failure of international diplomacy, and the unchecked ambitions of totalitarian regimes. The world held its breath as a new era of global conflict began. Just over 2 weeks after the German invasion, on September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union launched its own invasion of eastern Poland, acting on the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. With Polish forces already shattered by the German onslaught, resistance was minimal. The two invading powers met, effectively carving up Poland between them. This cynical division by two totalitarian regimes extinguished Polish sovereignty and demonstrated the ruthless pragmatism of the pact. Poland became the first major victim of World War II, crushed between two powerful and unforgiving neighbors. After the rapid conquest of Poland, a strange period known as the Phony Wars or Sitzkrieg, sitting war, descended upon Western Europe. For 8 months, from September 1939 to April 1940, there was little to no direct combat between the Allied forces of Britain and France and Germany along the Western Front. Troops mobilized, defenses were built, but no major offensives were launched. This lull created an eerie calm, leading some to hope the war might simply fade away, while others sensed it was merely the prelude to a far greater storm. While the Western Front was quiet, conflict raged in the Nordic north. In November 1939, the Soviet Union, seeking territorial concessions and security against future German aggression, invaded Finland. The ensuing Winter War proved a brutal and unexpectedly difficult conflict for the Red Army. Despite overwhelming numerical superiority, Finnish forces, led by Field Marshal Mannerheim, displayed fierce resistance, utilizing their knowledge of the terrain and harsh winter conditions. While Finland ultimately ceded territory, its valiant defense embarrassed the Soviets and demonstrated the surprising resilience of a small nation against a Goliath. During the Phony War, the battle for control of the seas was very real. German U-boats immediately began sinking Allied merchant shipping, threatening Britain's vital supply lines. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun. Surface raiders also saw action, notably the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee, which terrorized South Atlantic shipping before being cornered and scuttled in the Battle of the River Plate. These early naval engagements highlighted the critical importance of sea control and the ongoing threat posed by German naval power, even before the land war truly ignited. The lull on the Western Front ended abruptly in April 1940 when Germany launched simultaneous invasions of Denmark and Norway. Denmark surrendered within hours. Norway, however, put up a fierce fight with Allied assistance. Hitler's strategic aim was to secure vital iron ore supplies from Sweden, shipped through Norway, and establish naval and air bases to improve Germany's access to the Atlantic. The Norwegian campaign, while ultimately successful for Germany, exposed weaknesses in both German logistics and Allied planning, signaling the end of the Phony War and the beginning of intense fighting. The German invasions of Poland, Denmark, and Norway were not isolated incidents but part of a meticulously planned strategy, building upon years of rearmament and tactical innovation. The Blitzkrieg was more than just fast tanks, it was a revolution in military thought, emphasizing speed, surprise, and concentration of force, supported by air power. This doctrine aimed to avoid the static trench warfare of World War I, instead seeking decisive breakthroughs and rapid encirclement. The stage was now set for the ultimate test of this new warfare doctrine, against the formidable defenses of France and the Low Countries. Looking back, the policy of appeasement, championed by Britain and France, proved disastrous. While born from a genuine desire to prevent another global conflict, it ultimately emboldened Hitler, allowing Germany to rearm, remilitarize, and annex territories without meaningful opposition. Each concession made Hitler bolder, reinforcing his belief that the Western democracies were weak and indecisive. the failure to confront aggression early on meant that when war finally came, Germany was stronger, and the Allies were strategically disadvantaged, facing a more formidable and expansionist foe. By the spring of 1940, the world was irrevocably at war. The initial skirmishes and invasion served as a brutal prologue, demonstrating the destructive potential of modern warfare and the ruthlessness of the Axis powers. The stage was now set for the decisive battles of the Western Front, where the fate of Europe and, indeed, the free world would be determined. This was not merely a conflict of nations, but a clash of ideologies: democracy against totalitarianism, freedom against tyranny, and the forces of conquest against those who sought to defend their sovereignty. The true storm was about to break. The shadow of the First World War loomed large over the interwar period. The unresolved grievances, the economic devastation, and the psychological trauma profoundly influenced the subsequent political landscape. The desire to avoid another such conflagration drove the policy of appeasement, while the perceived injustices of the Versailles Treaty fueled German revisionism. World War II, in many ways, was a direct continuation and culmination of the forces unleashed by its predecessor, a tragic testament to the failure to build a truly stable and equitable peace after the first global conflict. A critical factor in the outbreak of World War II was the alarming rise of totalitarian regimes. In Germany, Italy, and Japan, democratic governance crumbled, replaced by states that exerted absolute control over every aspect of public and private life. These regimes glorified the state, suppressed dissent, and embraced aggressive nationalism and militarism. They saw war not as a last resort, but as a legitimate tool for achieving national greatness and ideological purity. The inherent expansionist nature of totalitarianism made a future conflict almost inevitable. Ideology played a profound and destructive role in shaping the path to war. Nazism's racial fanaticism and quest for Lebensraum, Italian fascism's imperial ambitions, and Japanese militarism's Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere were not mere political platforms, they were deeply held beliefs that justified conquest, oppression, and ultimately, genocide. These ideologies demonized others, glorified violence, and imbued their followers with a sense of destiny, making compromise impossible and conflict unavoidable. Understanding these core beliefs is crucial to grasping the sheer scale of the conflict that unfolded. Economic conditions were not just a backdrop but a driving force behind the global slide into war. The Great Depression exacerbated existing grievances and created widespread desperation. It undermined public confidence in democratic systems, making the promises of strong leaders more appealing. For resource-poor nations like Germany and Japan, economic self-sufficiency, often termed autarky, became a powerful justification for territorial expansion. The quest for raw materials, markets, and economic dominance fueled aggressive foreign policies, turning economic hardship into a catalyst for military adventurism. The dream of collective security, embodied by the League of Nations, utterly failed to prevent World War II. Its structural weaknesses, lack of enforcement mechanisms, and the reluctance of major powers to intervene against aggression allowed a series of violations to go unpunished. Each instance, from Manchuria to Ethiopia to the Rhineland, eroded the League's authority and emboldened aggressors. The lesson was stark: without a credible threat of force, international agreements and institutions were powerless against nations determined to pursue their aims through violence. This failure had devastating repercussions. By 1939, the major powers were coalescing into two opposing blocs, though fluid and complex. The Axis powers, Germany and Italy, soon to be joined by Japan, were united by revisionist goals, anti-communism, and a disdain for democratic norms. The Allied powers, primarily Britain and France initially, were democracies committed to upholding international law and defending sovereign states, though often hesitant and divided. The Soviet Union, having signed the pact with Germany, temporarily stood apart. This fundamental ideological and geopolitical divide made a full-scale confrontation almost inevitable. The path from fragile peace to total war was a gradual but inexorable escalation. Each act of aggression, each failure of diplomacy, each violation of treaties pushed the world closer to the brink. From the remilitarization of the Rhineland to the Anschluss, from the Sudetenland to the invasion of Czechoslovakia, Hitler tested the resolve of the international community. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact cleared the final obstacle, giving Germany the green light to invade Poland. The declarations of war by Britain and France were not sudden outbursts, but the culmination of years of unchecked aggression. As we conclude this first part of our journey, the world stands irrevocably at war. The fragile peace that followed World War I had collapsed under the weight of economic depression, political extremism, and the failure of collective action. Totalitarian regimes, driven by expansionist ideologies, had systematically dismantled the international order, while democracies struggled to find a unified and effective response. The invasion of Poland and the subsequent declarations of war were not merely isolated events but the final, tragic chapter of a long and complex prelude. The stage is now set for a conflict of unprecedented scale and horror, the next chapter of which we will explore in Part 2.